hope you're well. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. It is back to school time for many kids and college students, which is what inspired this video. I wanted to pull together a list of books that I wish I had read during my high school English class many moons ago. As far as BIPOC authors and LGBTQ authors, there wasn't much on offer. To be quite honest, if we read a BIPOC author, it was like once a year, so it kind of felt like a token book. And because I went to a Catholic high school, I don't recall ever really touching upon LGBTQ anything because of the church's stance. This video was inspired by a comment that Perishable Reads left on, I believe it was my BookTube newbie tag video, which I'll link above. Which one is it? She wondered if the answer to getting people to read more diversely was replacing some of the books that are in our canon with books by BIPOC or LGBTQ authors. So that's what I've tried to do here. Let's get started. So the first book on my list is one that has featured very prominently on my channel at this point, Nella Larsen's The Passing. I will link the Harlem Renaissance video where I talk about this book in detail. But as far as adding this to the curriculum goes, I loved The Great Gatsby, but I would love to see this book on the high school reading list, maybe in its place. They check a few of the same boxes, so they're both written in the 1920s and they're both American literature. But what I find interesting about it is that I feel that the book itself could lend to conversations on race and on identity. The two characters are black women who can pass as white, but I think you could also talk about things like Claire and Irene being foils of each other potentially, or questions about whether Claire is some sort of anti-hero. And I think the ending itself, which I'm not going to spoil for you all, I think that there is a conversation to be had about how this book ends and what it actually means. So I feel like it's a text that is really rich and digestible, and for that I think that it would benefit a lot of high school English students to read this. So that's what I have to say about that one. The next book is James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. This is really a book that is in the LGBTQ literary canon. Since I haven't read it yet, I can't speak much to its plot yet. From what I've read, it is set in Paris and it's about a young man dealing with his feelings and desires for another man. But I think it's really interesting as a book for high school students to read because of the themes that it covers. So it covers this idea of social alienation, identity again, homosexuality, bisexuality. But what I really found compelling about this as far as a book for high schoolers is that in college you tend to look at books in English classes or even in the history classes I took as the byproducts of the society they were written in. So they're a commentary on the society and culture that the author is living in, and you take that into account when reading it. You don't do that as much, or at least we didn't in my high school classes, and I think that this loans itself to that opportunity. This was a book that James Baldwin's publisher told him to burn because of the stigmas and the irrational fears about homosexuality and bisexuality at the time that this was written. So I think you could really have a conversation about that and about the history of LGBTQ in the United States. So that's why, that is my long-winded way of saying that's why this book is on the list. So the next book is one that I don't have in my collection. I read it in bits and pieces during one of my American Lit survey courses in college and have promptly put it on my TBR after rediscovering it It is The Woman Warrior by Maxine Kingston, and there are a few reasons that I put this on my list. In English classes, we didn't really have much exposure to nonfiction in English class. It was, for the most part, something that if you did read it, it was for like summer reading for your history class, and it was a biography or an autobiography or something like that. And I picked this one because it is nonfiction and it is a memoir, so it still lends itself to being a piece of literature. But I also picked this because it is a book about being a woman and about being a Chinese American living in the US. I think that's an experience that's worth exploring, as is the case with any experience that is different from your own. I think that it's a book that lends itself to discussions about language. Maxine Kingston is writing in English, but she is using the tone and rhythms of the Chinese language to show this melding of Western culture and Chinese culture. And so I think it would be interesting to have a conversation about that, that isn't about like iambic pentameter and things like that. But Maxine Kingston is also showing that melding in her imagery and metaphors throughout the book. So there's a lot of that to kind of really digest and pick up on. And I think too that she includes a lot of Chinese folklore, which is something that is unique to this book. Again, I haven't read this book yet in its entirety, but I plan to, so I can't really talk much to the actual story plot itself, but I think those interesting aspects of the book as a whole make it a compelling addition for the high school curriculum. Next up is House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. And I actually think this is a book that a number of people have read in high school or in college. I have not. The book that I read was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It seems like it had to be one or the other, not both, which I think is a bit of a problem in and of itself. But I picked this book because I do think that as a coming-of-age story, a Bildungsroman, as it were, it's speaking to the right age group for high school. It is about a young Mexican-American girl, a Chicano, living in Chicago. This is a book that talks about gender roles and feminism, from what I gather, and is a book that, again, you can look at language and identity, which a lot of these books, as I'm talking about them to you now, do deal with identity, and I feel like what better time to discuss identity than with 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. Next up is Angels in America, a gay Fantasia on national themes by Tony Kushner. I would have much rather have read this than Rosencrantz and Guildenstern is Dead by Tom Stoppard. We read Hamlet. I didn't feel that we needed to read a modern adaptation of Hamlet. It just wasn't necessary. If you wanted to read a play, a contemporary American play, I feel like this would have been a fantastic alternative. This is a play that is important within LGBTQ canon. It speaks to the AIDS epidemic from a historical standpoint. I feel that it is a really impactful and important play. I also think that it lends itself to conversations on the society and culture from which this play sprung, similar to why I picked Giovanni's Room, because it is really a social commentary, and it deals with things like race and ethnicity, homosexuality, religion, and I understand that the conversations themselves might not necessarily be easy for some. They might be intensely uncomfortable for others, but just because something is uncomfortable, just because Just because something is uncomfortable doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk about it. But it really is just what I feel like an important and oftentimes ignored piece of literature when it comes to the English lit curriculum for high schoolers. My last book I've added and have a reason. The author is not BIPOC or LGBTQ to my knowledge, but hear me out. I'm adding this because I realized that when it comes to plays, we didn't actually have much exposure to female playwrights. And so I've picked a play by a female playwright because I do feel that women playwrights are underrepresented. I give you The Rover by Aphra Ben. I read this again in college, and I've picked it for a few reasons. Everyone reads Shakespeare. I feel like bare minimum you read one Shakespearean play a year in high school. I love Shakespeare, but I wouldn't be against us replacing one of those Shakespearean plays with The Rover by Aphra Ben. She is an early modern English playwright, so she's writing in the 17th century, and she's actually the first woman in England, I believe, to actually make a living as a writer. So that's pretty cool and gives you some history that you can talk about in your English class. It's this somewhat comical set of misadventures with these English men and women running wild in carnival or at carnival and pursuing their love interests, and it deals with a lot of feminist issues and gender issues. So the two characters of Florinda and Helena are constantly bucking against paternal and fraternal authority, which would have been like controversial or completely against the norm at the time when this was written. And it deals with these ideas of female agency and marriage and love, and it's just, I think that gives an interesting perspective that is different from a Shakespeare, who is a white man, writing about women like Lady Macbeth and Ophelia, Gertrude, oh my god, I'm drawing a blank, Juliet. This is a play written by a woman about women and agency. And so yeah, those were my books by BIPOC authors, LGBTQ authors, and underrepresented authors on the whole that I think would be a really good fit with the high school English curriculum. I know I would have loved to have read them at that time, bearing in mind I am a English lit nerd and a bookworm like probably most of you out there watching this video now. I want to thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did like the video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe. I will see you next Thursday. Bye!